Thanks, everybody. So, this is Kyle. So, you recognize Kyle's face from your lab manual. So, Kyle, I stole one off your LinkedIn website. So, the wonders of the internet. As you know, Kyle's opened a new business here in Newburgh, and we're using his yeast to try to identify what the different species of the wild yeast are. So I asked Kyle to come in and just talk a little bit about what his business is, how he got into the business of making cider. He might talk a little bit about the yeast, a little bit about the process of how you make cider. I'm going to erase the board just in case he wants to. I don't know how your drawing skills are, Kyle. Mine are terrible, but yeah. Okay. Well, I think my students will say that mine are worse if you really can see this. So feel free to ask him any questions. He's a young businessman. Some of you may be interested in starting your own business, so he certainly has a lot of experience in that field. And so let's leave a round of applause and thank you for coming.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Thanks for going through and looking at the yeast that I've collected over the last year pretty much. Start from the beginning. I started my first business at 22, right as I left college. That first business was also a cidery. I went to school for finance, so ended up in a far different field than what I was expecting to do, but I'd always thought I was going to do something with business, and if I didn't get into it in time, I probably would have done like consulting or something like that. But one person sat me down when I was doing a bunch of business plan competitions in college, and they said, you need two things to make it in business. Either you need money or you need the technical expertise. And as far as cider making was concerned, I had neither. Luckily, my father went to UC Davis for viticulture and winemaking, and that's one of the best winemaking colleges in the U.S. So we got together, we started talking about cider because cider was a growing industry at the time. It was really big in Europe. It was just starting to be big here, so we're talking, 2011-ish. This is when, Angry Orchard hadn't even hit the market yet. I know you guys don't drink it all, ever, being underage and whatnot. So you may not know that name, but you will soon, I'm sure. So we decided to start from a very simple standpoint of how we wanted to craft cider. In business, one of the most important things, at least in my opinion, is not to spread yourself out and try to do everything. Instead, be extremely focused and just niche as much as you possibly can. Because otherwise, there's so much competition out there. If you don't make yourself stand out, then what's the point of even doing anything, in my opinion. So, we decided to do all old world style ciders, which we started off saying, oh, we're going to do everything that's going to be fermented and aged in oak barrels. No matter how big we get, everything will always be in oak. So that's how we started. I believe in experimentation, especially with the business model. I mean, cider was still very new on the market, so trying to figure out what we wanted to do. And I'm going to back up and start and explain kind of what styles of cider there are in the world. Especially since you guys have never drank anything before, you probably have no concept of what cider even is. So first, very simply, cider is just fermented apple juice. So it's not a brewing process, it's not a distilling process, it's more of a winemaking process. You're pretty much just making apple. So in the most basic form, you get your apple juice in, you add yeast to it if you want to. Half the time you don't even need to add yeast because there's yeast existing on the skins of the apples themselves. You let it sit in a dark room, devoid of oxygen, typically in a glass container, and it'll ferment over the next month pretty much into an alcoholic beverage. I don't recommend doing this with any of this at home as well. Because again, you guys are all don't drink it. So that's the most basic form of what cider is. Now, in America right now, there are the macro version of cider, which is, interestingly enough, the hardest style of cider to make. Cider doesn't want to be sweet, despite everyone who drinks cider saying, "Oh, this is what American cider is." In my opinion, cider was brought into the marketplace to replace Smirnoff Ice and stuff like that. What in the industry we call RTDs, because it's the more natural style. So So people are like, oh, I'm healthier if I'm drinking cider because it's made from apples, and we like going out and picking apples during the fall season, and it's all the same stuff, pretty much. So in that process, it's a large mechanical process. Typically, they're using apple juice concentrates. They're fermenting to dryness and then adding some sort of sweetness back, either pasteurizing the juice or adding some sort of chemicals to stabilize it so that it remains sweet. And typically, they can do this process within a week. From start to finish, it'll be in the package and going out to stores. So that's American cider. That's traditional American cider. What we decided to focus on was what was going on in Europe. Now Europe has a long cider making tradition. So, for example, English cider to Spanish cider to French cider, and there's many permutations between each of the different areas as far as the ciders styles are. But for example, British style is typically very Brett heavy, and Brett's one of the yeast strains that you guys are looking at that I captured. It typically is extremely funky, and by funky I mean like sharp as farmhouse, horse blanket, shoe leather, things that most people wouldn't necessarily like to drink, but kind of as you get more into this style, you may or may not veer into this. So there's generally, they have the existing apple growing culture there. They've been doing this for at least 400 years. So they have lots of tannic apples, and tannic apples create bitterness. Now you go into the supermarket and you guys bite into any apple. Those are all called, in our industry, dessert varietals. Generally very pleasant to eat, sweet, decent acidity to sugar ratio. But you go into the apple orchards out there, you bite into the apples, and a lot of these are extremely bitter. In fact, there's over 3,000 varietals of apples across the world. They've had to breed them to actually get them to be sweet and pleasant to eat. So store apples are very different from what's out there. So all European style cider, either if it's Spanish, it's generally very tart, acidic, but almost all of it's bone dry, with the exception of some of the French stuff, which is key, where they pull all the yeast nutrients off the apples and age it. So we did stuff very much in that style, very old world, a bunch of different yeasts, and we fermented it and we put it in a barrel. We let it go at around 50 to 60 degrees. Temperature control is one of the most important pieces in the fermentation and aging of cider, because you're trying to create a happy microbiome for all of the different yeast and bacteria to live and grow and make nice, flavorful products. We would do a lot of stuff with blending, where we would, we started with about 30 oak barrels, and by the end of last year had about 500 that we did all our fermentation and aging in. And we would take single varietal apples, ferment them and age them separately, and then blend them after aging to create different complexities and flavor profiles. We would then we source everything within 150 miles for all of our ingredients. We tried to use old American traditional apple varietals, since the European varietals really aren't planted and grown here yet. And then also would work with local hops, local ginger. We made mead as well, which is honey wine, and like local berries and all that stuff. Made seasonal varietals, and I think before I left to come up here and start Graft, we sold into 7 different states like California, Washington, New York, which was one of the reasons why I came up here, Maryland, DC, and did quite well for ourselves. We were ranked Rate Beer, which is one of the largest consumer rating websites for beer and cider as well. We had top 15 ciders in the world. We had 3 ranked in the top 15. So did quite well there. But the biggest nagging issue that I had with the styles that we were making was we charged $16 to $30 for a 750 milliliter bottle, and there's only so many accounts you can get into at that price point. So people say, we love your cider, but we can never get past the top 10% of accounts out there. So if you go over to Europe, you can get these dry, slightly tart, funky styles of cider for like €3. So it's like, is the process really that more difficult? And we always knew that, yeah, we could make cider for a lot cheaper, but if you add in the barrels and the aging time, because we would age that for 6 months, all the way up to a year and a half, it's quite difficult to get, to be able to sell it at a reasonable price, and then also scale and all that stuff will determine the price that you sell something at. So the goal was to take cider and take what was in the market currently. And currently, yeah, it'd be great to use European apple varietals. It'd be great to use old heritage apple varietals, but the landscape and the apple growing landscape in America isn't there yet. And apples take 5 years minimum to grow from a seedling all the way up to being able to produce fruit. So to get that going, especially when a lot of people are starting cideries, they're leveraging their houses, they're doing whatever they can to get them started. You can't just wait around for 5 years for an apple tree to be ready with the perfect apples for your cider. So, that being in mind, I would have to use dessert varietals to make what I wanted to make in a large scale. So how do you make dessert varietals taste good? Well, the macro cider makers have been doing it by adding sugar to it, and that's about it. Adding carbonation and then adding interesting flavors here and there. For me, I don't really like sweet things, and I absolutely dislike greatly American-based ciders, at least the mainstream ones. So we decided to focus on yeast, and in the trials before I left my other company, to come up here, we were doing fermentations with very basic dessert varietals like Golden Delicious, Pink Lady, Jonna Gold, stuff like that, things that aren't really all that rare to come by. And we found that utilizing wild yeast that we had built up in our cidery over time, just from the pure happenstance of us fermenting batch after batch and then reusing those same oak barrels that then house the yeast and bacteria, that we were getting really interesting characteristics from this kind of microbiome that we were creating in the area. In fact, when we started in this old 18th century grist mill, and when we moved to, we added an additional facility to do a larger portion of our barrel aging, we actually brought down large carboys of just lees, and lees are just what kind of ends up, it's all the sediment after 6 to 1 year period of aging that ends up at the bottom of the barrels. It's dead yeast that are autolyzing. It's the fallout from the apple particles. So it's laden with yeast, bacteria. Brought these lees down, and I got one of my cellar masters and just mopped it across the floors, and then we got a bunch of just buckets out, and I just threw sugar in them with the lees just to spew all of this bacteria and yeast into the air, so that we kind of created the same microbiome that we had at our cidery at the warehouse. Now, did that work? Maybe, I don't know, but it makes a really good story either way. So that's another takeaway. You got to really work with what you get in this industry. I mean, when we were starting out, we were making sweet styles just to test the market and see how it would go, and we were making clean ciders, and we were making berried ciders and hop ciders, and we decided after a while that instead of trying to make every cider under the wheelhouse, just to focus on making one style really well, and that's this kind of rustic cider that we ended with. So moving on to graft, once again, trying to bring down the price point, and focusing on yeast. Now, to make interesting ciders with wild yeast, you have to buy what's already on the market, what's been cultivated from a lot of the yeast labs, like Y Yeast and White Labs are some of the big providers of yeast out there. Yet almost all of this is either made for wine or beer. So I decided to instead focus on what we can find in the apple orchards. A lot of the beer makers, especially out in Belgium, would put their breweries, especially when they're making sour beers, which are very similar to the styles of cider they were making, near the fruit growers in their region, because all this natural yeast is there on the skins of the fruit. Now, the reason that is because the second the fruit falls off the tree, they've been bred for millions and millions of years to then eat whatever that is in that apple or that orange, or sorry, maybe not. I'm sure orange is that yeast as well. Apricot, whatever's falling off there. So they've been doing this for millions of years. We just are depriving them of oxygen and then creating alcohol and being able to drink it, as opposed to making vinegar before breaking it down. So I went to a bunch of organic orchards around the area. I've gone and found trees by the roadside. One of the ones that we're using for our main pitch was from a wild tree that I found in New Paltz. I just took the apples, pressed them, and then I fermented them, aged them for about a month, and then sent it down to my yeast lab, which was in Richmond, Virginia. And then they would look at our microscope and they would isolate out whichever yeasts were most prominent. And then they would send them back to me, and I would pitch them against juice. And we would see kind of if it was able to outcompete what was already in the new apple juice that we were bringing in, because these are always filled with their own yeast and bacteria. Completely different from the brewing side of things, where in brewing you're always boiling everything before you're adding the yeast. So you're pretty much killing everything off, then adding yeast, and then it starts the fermentation process. With cider, if you're not adding sulfites, which a lot of people do in the industry, that's something that we don't do making rustic cider, you have a large palette of yeast and bacteria that are already existing in your juice. So if you're adding a new yeast to it, you have to make sure that whatever you're adding there, especially if it's wild and not really trained, is going to outcompete whatever is there. After that, and we wait a month, we taste it, and we say, is this something worth continuing with? And one of the things that you guys are looking at is there a way of identifying between the different yeasts and different types of yeast, from Saccharomyces to Brettanomyces? Is there anything in the RNA analysis that will show esters or flavor creation that it's going to do, or show how quickly it's going to build itself up and be able to outcompete things? So that's really, I don't know, we're trying to do something different. We're trying to say, hey, apples, we want things that are on apples already, and we want it to ferment with apples because they've been doing it for as long as they've had, as opposed to saying, let's buy some wine yeast, let's buy some beer yeast, and make it work that way. So it'll be interesting to see what's found in the samples. In fact, while I was doing all this research, I thought with the different fermentations, I thought that we would be doing a lot of stuff where we just would be pitching straight yeast on top of the ciders, just going off and finishing them. But instead, we're doing a lot of stuff where we're pitching off the lees after the first fermentation is done. All that kind of debris and fallout will then put fresh juice on top of, and we found that at least we're hypothesizing that the bacterial populations are very high, so it'll allow for this souring and maturing of the cider even more rapidly than just adding these wild yeast in. One thing we've always found, and it's almost been true for almost any style of fermentation, whether making kimchi or making kombucha, is large swaths of a large microbiome is typically better and easier as far as creating complexity and flavor. I mean, the reason why beer would go bad so easily is because they're killing everything off and they're adding one yeast strain. Now, one other thing gets in there, there's nothing to stop it from just multiplying and creating bad beer. Now, with a culture where you have 30 different yeast and bacteria, they've all kind of already carved out their own niches, so you add something new in there, not much is going to change. I mean, I'll have brewers come down to our cidery, and I'll be just going in with like a wine thief from barrel to barrel to barrel, and just be blowing their minds because they'd have to sanitize it between every single run. But at that point, everything's set in its place, and if there's any sort of changes to the cider, it's going to be very small, and hopefully there's that complexity. So that's kind of an overview of what I do, cider-wise, and I thought I was going to get more into the business side of things, but I kind of got sidetracked. It's kind of interesting working with this audience. I'm so used to presenting to people that understand, they're already ingrained in the industry. They have a lot of industry talk, so having to pull back and kind of try to start from ground one. It's kind of an interesting talk. So I'm sorry if I rambled a little bit, but I've been trying to get it so you guys could somewhat understand it, coming from very little background. I don't know how well I achieved that, but that's my talk. So if anyone has any questions, because I don't know where I will put everything, feel free to ask.
Questions for Kyle? So the different yeast strains, are they all from this area?
No,
Okay.
no. So some are from Maryland. Some of them I captured from an orchard that we were using for. It was a lost orchard, so it used to have. It was actually really interesting to see what happened there. It was growing dessert varietals along with some heritage varietals about 30 years ago, but the person that was caring for the orchard stopped caring for it, and the apples that probably once were the same that you find in a grocery store were now about this big, almost the size of a crab apple, and the acidity had increased and the tannins had increased in all the apples, and it's mainly just a defense mechanism because they couldn't survive without the sprays that were there. So in the cider world, this is a great thing because you're getting interesting characteristics out of the apples as opposed to just getting, acidity and sugar. You're now getting tannins with, interesting acidity, and then flavor compounds will be a little bit different when they have to protect themselves. So I got some of the yeast out of that, what we called a lost orchard. Up here in the Hudson, I found an orchard in New Paltz. I found a tree growing on the side of the road in New Paltz, just mashed it up, did a fermentation, and then sent it in. And then in the Finger Lakes, I actually took staghorn sumac because it was winter, and I grabbed the staghorn sumac and actually took pasteurized juice from the supermarket because you want, in my opinion, I'm trying to find something that is only from the actual places that I'm finding. So pasteurized is fine because it's killed everything off, and only the things coming in on the staghorn sumac will be the flavors being created. And then I've also done some tests right outside with an orchard with a friend of mine that makes cider out in Pennsylvania in the hill country. So we went out to his orchard, an area that hadn't been sprayed, collected some apples, did some fermentation on those. So the goal is over time to keep collecting different yeast from different areas, and it's extremely interesting to see because what's in the air or what's on the apples or sumac or fruit that's out there changes from season to season. I mean, what's out there middle of summer is typically not what you want to have because there's high acidic acetobacter in the air, which is what creates vinegar and a lot of other things. So typically you're looking for cooler nights to collect them, but right now with the way the industry is, everything it's no holds bar. So getting something in the middle of summer might be an interesting flavor profile, and figuring out how to work with that. So I think eventually I'm going to even find one single area and collect like a seasonal yeast thing and just see how different it is from one time to the next.
Do these yeast strains have to be FDA approved, or?
No, as long as they make it alcoholic enough that it's going to kill the majority of stuff. I mean, everything we do is underneath a winery license. Again, despite the fact that everyone's like, oh, how's the distillery or how's the brewery? It drives me crazy because distillation is the heating up of fermented alcohol until you make spirits, and brewing involves a heating process. But no, there's no approval process that needs to be taken with yeast. I mean, as long as it does its job and doesn't just ferment to vinegar or start allowing some sort of growth going on. But at the end of the day, that would never happen with cider unless you pasteurize it beforehand, because there's just so much living there. Now, I have noticed a large difference between sprayed orchards and unsprayed orchards, which is why I found organic or unsprayed orchards as much as possible, because there's just more diversity. When you start adding sprays and chemicals, it starts decreasing the diversity of what's there. And this is all just from first-hand experiences, as me putting it under a microscope. So the partnership that we're kind of building with the university is saying, hey, a lot of what we've done is art or observation, but I think since we're going with more of a kind of mainstream product, incorporating more science and understanding more of exactly what's going on will be really beneficial to the process. And we're still just finding out how and what's important to find out is kind of the first step. So when we do these RNA analysis, it really is to see what we can find and what we can discern from that. So it's like the first piece in the stepping stone to saying, what can we do with the science that we've gained, as opposed to me just saying, oh, well, I like this one.
So, looking at, say, the cider making process, or maybe even the brewing process and wine making process, so these are fields that are getting really big. how useful do you think it would be to have an understanding of, say, genetics and microbiology nowadays going into these fields where in the past people would just say, buy yeast and use it, and now there's people interested in actually understanding the science behind it. Do you think having that sort of background might be useful if you're interested in starting a business or becoming part of a business?
Absolutely. And I mean, this goes back to the knowledge aspect when you're starting a business. With the way the industry is growing, you need to have that technical expertise on your side, I think, especially in the beer world. I mean, you need to be creative as well as what you're doing and branding, but you can bring someone on to do branding, because if you can't make good product and have good, solid controls, you can't make it in the industry. Right? Everyone's making stuff that's too good, and you're going to see, I think, a massive shift in the industry where a lot of these small breweries, unless they're like a brew pub, so they have that kind of financial arm, just going out of business, because the entire industry, I don't know if you've ever heard anything about it, it's always like friendly, like I was just in Brooklyn yesterday because we're doing something with cheesecake where they're washing cheeses with all of our yeast and bacteria and letting it grow on there. But afterwards I went down to a brewery that we've done collaborations with, where we come together and we come up with different blended styles of cider and beer. But everyone says, everyone's really happy in the industry and everyone shares secrets. But even talking to them yesterday, they're like, they're fighting over hop contracts, and there's certain people in the industry just won't share the way they were before because there's only so many draft lines, and there's, like 1,000 new breweries every year. So having a certain level of quality and being able to quantify the quality and be able to replicate all requires degrees in genetics or microbiology, and it's invaluable if you want to be an important piece in a new business, or you want to get involved as the brewer or the winemaker or the cider maker.
To start a company.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thanks, Kyle.
Yeah.
So